Hello kids, welcome to the Dream Journey. Today we are going to tell a new story about a girl named Elara, a quiet workshop, and the magic of mending dreams. Picture this. Deep within a grand royal palace filled with marble halls and golden ceilings, there's a secret corner that few ever visit. Down a narrow stone path, past the humming garden wall, is a small courtyard wrapped in ivy and warm sunlight. There, tucked like a hidden treasure, sits the workshop of the royal Toymaker. It doesn't look like much from the outside. A wooden door, a crooked window, a roof patched with moss. But inside, that's where the real magic lives. On shelves and workbenches, in drawers and little wooden boxes, you'll find bits of laughter, fragments of dreams, and broken things that once made children smile. And there, sweeping sawdust from the floor and gently winding thread through the eye of a needle, is Elara, the Toymaker's apprentice. She's not very big. She doesn't wear a crown or swing a sword. But she has the most powerful gift of all. The ability to listen. Every evening, as the palace quiets and the sky softens into shades of lavender, Elara enters a special room within the workshop. It's called the Palace of Mended Dreams. This isn't where new toys are made. It's where the broken ones go. Dolls with cracked faces, bears with one ear, horses missing their wheels. They're more than objects here. They are whispers of forgotten joy. And Elara is their keeper. She moves slowly, never rushing, her hands always warm. She doesn't just fix. She feels. She doesn't just patch. She comforts. And tonight, something is stirring in that room. A toy that has never wanted to be mended. Until now. The Palace of Mended Dreams wasn't grand. Not like the ballrooms with sparkling chandeliers or the throne room that echoed with polished boots. No, this room was humble. A quiet corner tucked inside the Toymaker's workshop, with a crooked sign hanging above the door, carved with stars, moons, and a swirl of thread that looped around each letter. The sign didn't creak because Elara had oiled it gently last week, humming as she worked. Inside, the room was dim and calm, like the space under a blanket on a rainy day. Wooden shelves lined the walls, each one filled with toys waiting patiently. Some had only small cracks. Others had been through much worse. Missing pieces, forgotten eyes, torn seams, or hearts that felt, somehow, a little too quiet. Each toy carried a weight not visible at first glance. Some were dropped in anger. Others were left behind during hard nights of crying. These weren't just accidents. They were echoes of feelings children couldn't quite say out loud. Elara believed the toys still remembered. So she treated this room like a chapel. She lit small lanterns each evening, one by one, as though waking up the stars. She laid out her little sewing kit. Thimble, thread, patches, and glue. Item placed just so. Then, before touching anything, she'd sit in the center of the room, legs tucked beneath her, and simply listen. It was never noisy. Not really. But if you were still enough, if you let the quiet wrap around you, you could feel it. The ache in the wooden horse's splintered wheel. The loneliness of a bear whose stuffing had shifted away from its chest. The longing of a doll whose tiny porcelain hands no longer held anything warm. Elara closed her eyes. "I'm here," she whispered. And the room exhaled. Elara moved like a whisper through the Palace of Mended Dreams. No sudden steps. No loud clinks. Just the soft brush of her slippers on the wooden floor and the faint jingle of thread spools in her apron pockets. She began her nightly routine the way one might tend to a sleepy garden, with quiet care and gentle rhythm. First came the shelves. She ran a cloth across each one, not to tidy for tidiness' sake, but because she believed the toys liked to feel noticed. Her cloth was soft and frayed, the color of buttered cream, and as it passed over the worn wood and resting toys, a hush seemed to settle over the room, as though the toys were holding their breath. Then she lit the little lanterns. 1, 2, 3. Their flames flickered like small, friendly stars waking from slumber. They didn't light the room fully. Elara didn't want them to. Shadows were part of the dream, after all. The light was warm, soft, and sleepy. At her work table, she laid out her tools. A curved bone needle, spools of dyed thread, and a tiny jar of golden glue that sparkled faintly under the candlelight. Each had its place. Each had a purpose. She paused, as she always did, to smile at the little patched tin, a gift from the Toymaker when she had first arrived. It was dented now, but she loved it all the more for that. Tonight, she chose a doll with a cracked porcelain cheek. Elara placed her gently on a silk cloth. "There we go," she whispered. "You've waited patiently." The doll didn't answer, of course. But something about the way her one eye seemed to catch the light made Elara believe she was listening. And so, the mending began. Not just of paint or lace, but of memory and heartache and long-lost comfort. The doll's name had once been Lila. Elara didn't know this for certain, but something about the delicate stitching of her dress and the faint rose scent still clinging to her ribbons told Elara she had been cherished. Her porcelain face was smooth except for one crack that ran from her left cheekbone to her jaw, like a tear frozen in time. One of her glass eyes was missing, and her tiny fingers were chipped at the tips. Elara cradled her gently, settling her into the silk cloth like a child being tucked into bed. "You've had a rough fall, haven't you?" she murmured, brushing a strand of synthetic hair from the doll's brow. She set her tools close but didn't touch them yet. Instead, she just sat beside the doll, hands resting on her lap. This was how the mending always began, not with glue or thread, but with presence. Listening even when nothing was said. The room felt still. Outside, the wind stirred a few leaves in the courtyard, but within these walls, time softened. Elara closed her eyes and let her mind wander. She imagined Lila once sitting on a royal windowsill, perhaps balanced precariously by a little girl distracted by her own tears. Tumble, crack, small gasp, and then silence. Elara didn't blame the child. She never did. Sadness can make hands clumsy. That's what the Toymaker had told her once. She gently turned Lila's face toward the light. "Let's help you remember who you were," Elara whispered. From her drawer, she took out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a collection of saved eyes. No two exactly alike. But after a moment of searching, she found one. Sea glass green with a soft glimmer. It wasn't a match, but it had its own kind of kindness. She smiled. "This one will do just fine." Elara saved the tin soldier for last that night. He always stood propped up at the edge of the shelf, leaning slightly on his bent arm, like a noble knight who refused to sit, even when weary. His red jacket had once gleamed with a gold stripe, though it had long since dulled with time. The paint on his boots was chipped, and one eye had faded to a soft blur. But it was his arm, his right one, that sagged awkwardly at the joint. It hung at his side like it no longer believed in salutes. She picked him up carefully, as though lifting a small piece of history. His body, cool and metallic, was etched with scratches from years of play. Still, something in the way his chin tilted upward made Elara smile. "You look like you've seen every parade in the kingdom," she said. He didn't answer, of course. But Elara imagined his story anyway. She pictured a time when the tin soldier had been part of a regiment, a row of brave brothers lined up on a nursery shelf, proudly watched by a child in polished shoes. Maybe one day, he'd fallen in the middle of pretend battle. Or perhaps he'd been dropped when the child got older, forgotten in the rush to grow up. The damage to the arm was clean but old, like a wound worn long enough to become familiar. Elara opened her patch kit and pulled out a tiny brass rivet, polished to a shine. With tweezers and soft clamps, she began to work, whispering all the while. "You're not broken," she said. "You're just waiting to move again." The soldier leaned back slightly as she tightened the joint, and when she finally let go, his arm lifted, just enough to salute. Elara straightened and gave a solemn nod. "At ease, brave one." And she placed him gently back on the shelf, where the candlelight glinted across his chest. The bear was soft once, Elara could tell. Beneath the faded velvet fur and uneven stuffing, there was a gentleness that clung to him like a scent. His ears had been tugged into mismatched shapes. One paw was flat and threadbare, and his button nose had rubbed smooth. He looked tired, not from age, but from carrying something too heavy for too long. Elara placed him in her lap like a storybook, worn and dog-eared, waiting to be reread. His small black eyes, stitched long ago, didn't glisten anymore. They looked dull, as if the dreams they once saw had slowly dimmed. "This one's different," she murmured. She cradled the bear, brushing a thumb across the place where fur had worn thin, just over the heart. Something was missing there. Not a patch or piece, but a feeling. This wasn't a bear who had been dropped or torn. This was a bear who had been forgotten. Forgotten toys didn't make a fuss. They didn't break loudly or lose their parts in fits of sorrow. They simply faded, bit by bit, like stars at dawn. Elara felt that kind of sadness deep in her chest. The kind that didn't shout. The kind that just waited. From her sewing box, she chose a patch shaped like a heart. It was made of old curtain fabric, soft, faded red, and stitched with a golden thread she saved for the quietest toys. She held it over the bear's chest. "Let's give you your hug back," she said softly. The stitching took time. She made each loop slow and smooth like a lullaby in thread. And as the heart-shaped patch took shape, Elara thought she felt the bear's body relax, just a little. By the time she tied the final knot, he looked lighter, as if, for the first time in a long time, he remembered what it felt like to be held. When the last stitch was tied and the tools tucked away, the room didn't fall silent, it sighed. A soft, contented hush, as though the toys themselves had drawn in a breath and gently let it go. The lanterns flickered lower, casting slow shadows along the floor, and the warmth of the mending lingered like the scent of something baked long ago. Elara sat back in her chair and listened. It wasn't music, not exactly. But in the stillness there was a feeling. The soft clack of wooden limbs settling, the delicate rustle of fabric as patched arms folded themselves more comfortably, and the tiniest of creaks from a rocking horse that hadn't moved in days. It was as though the toys, safe and restored, whispered to each other in a language only the very quiet could hear. Some nights, Elara imagined what they might say. "Did you see the new thread she used on me?" the soldier might boast, chest puffed with invisible pride. "She found my missing eye," Lila would reply, her porcelain voice chiming like teacups. "I remember being hugged," the bear might murmur, his patch still warm. Elara smiled, not with her mouth, but in that gentle way her shoulders softened and her breath slowed. The Toymaker once told her that love lingers in things that are loved well, and the Palace of Mended Dreams was full of such things. She walked slowly through the room, brushing her fingers along the shelves. Each toy she passed leaned ever so slightly toward her, like leaves leaning toward the sun. She paused at the door, hand resting on the carved wood. "Sleep well," she whispered. As she stepped out into the corridor, the glow of the lanterns dimmed behind her, until only one small flame remained, flickering gently, like a heartbeat, at the center of the mending room. Though the mending room now slept behind her, Elara's thoughts did not. As she tiptoed down the corridor and back into the main workshop, the hush of the night deepened around her. The ticking of distant clocks, the creak of wooden beams above, and the faint rustle of ivy brushing against the outer walls, all familiar sounds that whispered safety. But tonight, Elara's heart hummed with a different kind of rhythm. Curiosity. The Toymaker had always been kind, patient, but he was also very clear. Elara was not to make toys of her own, not yet. Her role was to mend, to listen, to learn. And she really had. But sometimes, especially on nights when the stories whispered louder than usual, her hands itched to create something new. On the far side of the workshop stood a table that was strictly off-limits. It was the Toymaker's sacred space, where new toys were born from blocks of wood, bolts of cloth, and the kind of ideas that could only come from silence. Elara had passed it every day. She had admired the carving knives, the spools of thread dyed in colors she wasn't allowed to touch, and the notebooks filled with beautiful, unreadable sketches. Tonight, she stood near that table a little longer. Her fingers hovered over a drawer handle. Just a peek, she thought. Just to see. But then she heard something. A sharp, muffled crash. Distant yet heavy. It came from the direction of the palace, not the workshop. Elara turned, her eyes wide. She felt it more than she heard it. The kind of sound that meant something had broken. Badly. She didn't open the drawer. She turned on her heel and hurried toward the sound. The mending room may have been her world, but outside it, something had just fractured. The palace was rarely noisy at night. Even the guards spoke in hushed tones and stepped lightly across the marble floors. But now, in the hush of the hour, something was wrong. Elara moved swiftly along the narrow garden path that connected the workshop to the royal corridors. The ivy rustled above her, and the wind tugged gently at her braid, as if trying to warn her. When she reached the side entrance to the palace, the heavy door stood ajar. That never happened. She slipped inside, her slippers nearly silent on the cool tile. Down one hallway, then another, she followed the faint echoes of startled voices and hurried footsteps, until she found it. A shattered vase lay across the floor of the royal playroom. Flowers, once arranged with care, were strewn like fallen stars. Nearby, a nanny crouched beside a little boy. His face red and scrunched, his fists clenched tight. The young prince. His golden curls stuck to his damp cheeks, and his eyes were brimming with a frustration too big for his small body. Beside him lay the wooden horse. Elara froze. She had seen the toy once before, through the workshop window. A beautifully carved horse, painted in glossy chestnut with a braided cord for reins and golden wheels that clattered merrily on marble floors. Now one wheel dangled uselessly. A deep gouge ran down its side. The reins were snapped. It didn't look hurt, it looked heartbroken. The prince shoved the nanny's hands away, then slumped onto the floor beside the toy, pressing his forehead to its chipped mane. He didn't cry like a baby. He cried like someone who didn't understand why the world had turned too loud, too fast, too sharp. Elara stepped back slowly. No one had noticed her. But something told her that the wooden horse, this toy, would be coming to her soon. And it would be unlike any she had mended before. The next morning the workshop was quiet. Dust motes floated in the golden light filtering through the crooked window, and the Palace of Mended Dreams still held the hush of toys at rest. Elara stood by the door, brushing crumbs from her apron when the knock came. It wasn't loud. Just 2 short taps, followed by the creak of the workshop door swinging open. A palace servant stood there, slightly breathless, holding a bundle wrapped in soft linen. "I was told. This is where broken toys go." Elara nodded and stepped aside. The servant laid the bundle gently on the low table near the wall, and bowed once before slipping back out the door. Elara waited until the latch clicked shut. Then she approached. With slow fingers, she peeled back the linen folds. A familiar shape emerged. The wooden horse. Even wrapped and still, he looked tense. His head hung slightly lower than before. His front legs still stiff from impact. The glossy chestnut paint was chipped, and the twine reins frayed into a mess of loose threads. Elara didn't speak. She simply stared. He was heavier than she expected when she lifted him, both in weight and in feeling. There was a silence around him that didn't feel peaceful. Felt like holding in too many words. Like when you want to cry but don't know how. She placed him in the center of the Palace of Mended Dreams, atop a fresh cloth, and knelt beside him. He did not seem to notice. Unlike the other toys who had some softness about them, some sense of waiting or weariness, the wooden horse seemed angry. Not wild or cruel, but coiled up like a spring wound too tight. As though every chip in his paint had a story he wasn't ready to tell. Elara rested her hand gently on his mane. "I don't know what happened yet," she whispered. "But I'm here when you're ready." He said nothing. But for the first time in a long time, the room felt different. For 3 days, the wooden horse said nothing. Course toys never spoke out loud. Not in words. But the others always gave signs. A loosened thread here, a shifting limb there. The way a stuffed bear tilted into her hand when it felt safe. They responded to Elara's presence. They softened. But not the horse. He remained exactly where she placed him. Still rigid. His gaze fixed toward the far wall like a soldier refusing to break rank. She tried to adjust his posture. He leaned back. She brushed his flank with a cloth. His wheels refused to turn. When she whispered a greeting each morning, there was no flicker, no shift of light in his painted eye. It was like he'd folded himself into a corner of silence and nailed the door shut from the inside. And still, Elara didn't give up. She cleaned him gently. Not too much. Just enough to clear the dust but leave the familiar wear. She sat near him while she worked on other toys, letting her voice rise and fall in calm narration as she stitched doll arms or replaced a soldier's button. She told stories of forest caravans and dream riders, of moonlit races and echoing laughter through pine trees. But the horse did not move. There was a sadness about him that felt sharp, not soft, like splinters instead of petals. A quietness that didn't ask for comfort. Elara recognized it. It was the silence of someone who had been shouted at too long, and now refused to open their mouth even to breathe. On the third evening, she set her needle down and looked directly at him. "I won't fix you until you're ready," she said. "But I'll still be here. Every night. Just in case." And for the first time she thought, though she couldn't be sure, that his head turned just the tiniest fraction. The next night, Elara brought no tools. No scissors, no thread, no glue. Just a small cushion and her favorite storybook. Worn, stitched at the spine, its pages curled like sleepy leaves. She placed the cushion near the wooden horse and sat cross-legged beside him. He still didn't look at her. That was all right. She opened the book and began to read. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, like wind through long grass. The story wasn't about kings or wars or magical spells. It was about a wooden horse. Not this one, of course, but another. And the little forest girl who had carved him from a fallen tree. The girl had no crown, no riches. Just a knife too big for her hand and a heart full of dreaming. As the story unfolded, Elara shifted her voice for each part. The trees rustled when they spoke, the girl giggled when she stumbled, and the horse, brave and quiet, never said a word but always listened. Elara didn't glance at the real horse beside her. But in the corner of her eye, she thought she saw something. one ear tilted ever so slightly toward the sound. She kept reading. In the tale, the girl and her carved companion journeyed through rivers, stars, and stormy fields. Each time the horse broke, the girl would pause, take out her carving knife, and fix him. Not to make him perfect, but to remind him he was still hers. Elara's voice dropped lower as the story reached its quiet end. A cabin in the hills, a warm hearth, and the horse resting beside the fire, still chipped, still quiet, but never alone. She closed the book with a soft thump. "You don't have to be ready tonight," she said gently. "But I thought you might like a story with someone a little like you." The horse didn't move, but the candlelight glinted in his painted eye like a faraway star. On the fourth night, the horse moved. It wasn't a big movement, not a dramatic shift, not the leap of a galloping stallion, but it was enough. Elara had just finished cleaning the doll with a chipped porcelain cheek and was setting her back on the shelf when she heard it. The faintest of creaks, the softest scratch of wood against cloth. Her heart stilled. She turned slowly, as if afraid to frighten him. The wooden horse stood upright on the cushion. His head turned just enough to meet her gaze. Something still distant, but no longer entirely locked away. Elara took a slow breath and smiled. Not with her lips, but with her whole heart. She set down the doll and walked softly toward the horse, kneeling beside him as she had the first night. He didn't move again, not yet. But there was a shift, a subtle weight that lifted from his frame. A sense that he was no longer carrying everything by himself. Elara reached out, not to fix him, not yet. Just to feel the grain of the wood beneath her fingertips. The smoothness of his painted eye. The slight tremor in his body. She could feel it. Tension, yes, but it was no longer the stiff, unyielding silence of before. There was room for something more now. Chance to heal. She didn't speak right away. She simply sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his flank. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be here too." And in that moment, the room felt a little brighter, the shadows a little less heavy. The next morning, as Elara worked, she felt it, a subtle shift in the air. It was as though the room itself had exhaled. The toys on the shelves seemed just a little less still, a little more alive, like a room full of forgotten dreams waking up. She glanced at the wooden horse. He hadn't moved overnight. But something had changed. The edges of his chipped paint seemed softer, less sharp. The wheel that had once hung uselessly now sat steady on the cushion. Elara's fingers twitched toward him, but she paused, unsure. He wasn't ready yet. But he was no longer unyielding. After a while, the door to the workshop creaked open. The Toymaker appeared, his old face lined with wisdom, his hands holding a small, carefully wrapped bundle. Elara stood as he approached, her heart giving a little skip. "I see you've been busy," the Toymaker said, smiling with a tenderness she didn't see often. He placed the bundle in her hands. Inside, a small wooden carving knife gleamed in the morning light, its handle worn smooth from years of use. "Tool for shaping dreams. For when you're ready," the Toymaker added softly. "For when you're ready to make things of your own." Elara's breath caught in her throat. The knife felt like the weight of 1,000 stories in her palm. It was simple, yet something about it seemed to hum with endless possibility. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude, but she didn't speak. Words weren't needed. Instead, she simply nodded. She would be ready. But for now, she turned back to the horse. And as she took a step toward him, her fingers brushed his side, just as they had the night before. And this time he didn't feel so heavy. Days passed. Each night, Elara returned to the mending room, her hands weaving through fabric and thread, her thoughts always lingering on the wooden horse. She hadn't yet used the carving knife. The tool rested beside her workbench, catching the soft glow of the lantern each evening, reminding her of the world she had yet to create. But the horse, he was changing in his own way. Each time Elara sat near him, she could feel the softest of shifts. The tension in his wooden joints was lessening. His painted eye, which had once been dull, now gleamed faintly in the candlelight. It wasn't just the silence of a toy waiting to be mended. It was the quiet of a heart slowly opening again, remembering how to dream. One evening, after she had finished repairing a soldier's bent arm, Elara decided it was time. She picked up the carving knife and stepped toward the wooden horse. The room seemed to hold its breath. She placed the blade gently against the edge of his mane. For a moment, she simply let it rest there. She didn't know what to carve. She didn't have a grand plan. But this was her moment. The moment when she would take what had been broken and offer something new. Something from her hands and her heart. With steady fingers, Elara began to carve. Slowly, she traced the lines of his mane, reshaping the sharp edges into a softer curve, making it less rigid, less angry. She worked quietly, the rhythmic motion of the knife becoming a kind of meditation. The wood responded to her touch, the once harsh surface now yielding beneath the blade. When she was finished, she stepped back. The horse wasn't perfect. His wheel still hung a little crooked, and the crack in his flank remained, but something had changed. He was no longer the silent soldier waiting for someone else to mend him. He was a toy in motion again, a toy with the potential to dream. Elara smiled and whispered softly, "You're ready now." The next morning, the palace was filled with a new energy. The air felt lighter, the halls less quiet. Elara moved through the workshop, her heart a little fuller. The horse had not only been mended, he had been transformed, both in form and in spirit. His posture was no longer rigid. His body now held a kind of readiness, a lightness that felt like potential. The Toymaker arrived in the late afternoon, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He paused at the door, watching Elara with a quiet smile as she worked. "You've done well," he said simply. There were no grand words, no extra praise, but his approval was clear in the way his eyes softened as he looked at the horse. Elara turned toward him, her hands still resting on the table where she had placed the horse. She felt a swell of pride, but also a deep sense of understanding. This was more than just fixing toys. This was about giving life back to something that had been left behind. This was about trust, the trust the toys had placed in her, and the trust she was learning to place in herself. "The horse," she began quietly. "He's ready now. Not perfect, but he's whole." The Toymaker nodded, a gentle chuckle escaping him. "No toy is perfect, not even the ones we create from the finest wood. But you've learned something important." Elara tilted her head, curious. "You've learned that the most important part of mending is understanding what's been broken. Not just the wood or the paint, but the part of the heart that needed fixing." The Toymaker paused and stepped toward the horse, gently brushing his hand across the smoothened mane. "This one will ride again. And when he does, he'll carry something new, something only you could give him." Elara smiled, her heart lifting with the understanding that her work was just beginning. She had mended the toys before, but now she was beginning to create something of her own. A space where dreams could heal, and hearts could be mended just as gently as the broken pieces of a forgotten toy. She walked over to the horse, running her fingers along his newly carved mane, and whispered softly, "You're ready now." The Toymaker, watching her, gave a soft, approving nod. And for the first time, Elara felt the true magic of her craft, not in fixing what was broken, but in bringing back what had been lost. The morning after the Toymaker's approval, The palace was filled with the sounds of children's laughter, no longer distant echoes but warm, genuine joy. The toys that Elara had mended were placed around the royal playroom, and the wooden horse stood at the far corner of the room, the soft hum of his new life filling the space. Elara stood in the doorway, watching. The children hadn't yet noticed the horse. They were busy with their own world of play, racing around in their own royal fantasy. But one by one, their eyes fell on the horse, drawn by some unseen thread. The youngest prince, the one who had broken him in the first place, was the first to step forward. He hesitated, his small hands twitching at his sides. The horse had once been a symbol of anger, of frustration. But now there was something new in his posture, something inviting. The prince reached out, his fingers brushing the wooden mane, and the air seemed to still around him. He paused. Then he climbed gently onto the horse's back, as though he had always known how to ride him. His face lit up with a slow, cautious smile. Elara watched from the doorway, her heart swelling. The horse was no longer a toy of past hurt or brokenness. He was a part of the world again, a part of the story, a part of the healing. The young prince looked up at her, his eyes wide, and for a moment, there was something unspoken between them. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. But in that look, Elara knew that the horse had found his place. And so had she. With a soft sigh, she stepped away from the doorframe and walked back to the workshop, where the rest of the toys waited. She didn't need to speak. Her work had already been done. And the mending room, the Palace of Mended Dreams, had given her the space to learn and grow, not just as an apprentice, but as a creator of new worlds, one toy at a time. The door closed quietly behind her, and for the first time, she felt like she belonged in that room, not just as a mender, but as someone who could shape the dreams of others. The days that followed were filled with quiet satisfaction. Elara continued her work, the mending room always full of toys waiting for their turn to heal. But now, there was a new sense of balance in her actions. She no longer just fixed. She understood the pieces, the silent stories each toy carried. Each day, she grew closer to the art of mending, not just with her hands but with her heart. One afternoon, as she was repairing a little doll's broken leg, the Toymaker entered the workshop with a quiet smile. He held a small bundle, wrapped in cloth, and placed it gently on the table before her. "Another for the Palace of Mended Dreams," he said softly, as if speaking to the room itself. Elara opened the bundle carefully, and there, lying before her, was a delicate wooden bird, one of the most beautiful toys she had ever seen. Its wings were carved with fine details, its body smooth and elegant. But there was something wrong. One of the wings was broken, its fine wooden edge chipped and splintered, as though the bird had flown too high and too fast, only to fall. Elara paused, her fingers gently tracing the broken wing. This was no simple repair. It would take patience, skill, and something else she had been learning along the way. Trust. The Toymaker stepped closer, watching her silently. Elara looked up, her expression quiet but determined. "I'll need to take my time with this one," she said softly. He nodded, his eyes filled with quiet approval. "You always have, Elara. You've always known when to take your time." Elara smiled, a small, content smile. She could feel the weight of the bird in her hands, the delicate nature of the wood, and the tender care that it required. As she sat down to begin the repair, she whispered to the bird, just as she had done with the horse. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll help you fly again." And with that she began. The days seemed to blur together as Elara worked on the bird. Each stroke of the carving knife, each gentle press of glue, each careful stitch of thread seemed to hold a new sense of meaning. The wing, once broken and jagged, began to take shape again. It was slow work, but Elara knew this was different. This wasn't just about fixing something that was damaged. This was about bringing something back to life piece by piece. She spent hours at her workbench, her hands steady, her mind focused on the task at hand. And as she worked, the room around her seemed to shift. The toys on the shelves were no longer just objects to be fixed. They were pieces of a larger story, a story that Elara was learning to write with every gentle movement of her hands. By the time the bird's wing was fully repaired, it looked even more beautiful than before. The lines were smoother, the shape more refined, but it still carried the marks of its past. A little chipped, a little weathered, but whole again. Elara stood back and admired her work. She didn't need to say anything. The silence in the room was enough. The toys rested around her, their quiet presence a testament to the care she had given them. They were more than just toys now. They were stories. They were dreams. As Elara carefully placed the bird back in the Palace of Mended Dreams, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The bird was ready to fly again. And just like the toys before it, it had found its way back into the world, not as something broken but as something new. She stepped back, her hands still warm from the work, and whispered softly, "You'll fly again, little one." And with that, the mending room fell into a peaceful quiet, the toys resting in their place, waiting for the next story to be told. The days that followed felt like a dream, a quiet, peaceful drift toward something new. Elara continued to work, as always, in the mending room. But now there was a lightness to her steps, a sense of fulfillment that lingered with each toy she repaired, each story she brought back to life. The workshop had become a place not just of restoration, but of creation. Every toy she mended wasn't just fixed, it was reborn. Each one carried something of her heart in it, a little piece of her patience, her understanding, her care. One evening, as the last of the daylight faded and the room grew soft with the glow of lanterns, the Toymaker stood in the doorway, watching her work. She paused for a moment, looking up at him, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected: pride. Not just in her skill but in her journey. "You've learned well," he said, his voice gentle. "You've always known what it takes to heal a broken toy. But you've also learned to heal something else, yourself." Elara smiled softly, the weight of his words sinking in. She hadn't just mended the toys in the Palace of Mended Dreams. She had mended something inside herself too. In each moment of patience, in each story shared, she had found something new in her craft and in herself. "I think I'm ready," she whispered almost to herself. "Ready to make my own." The Toymaker nodded, a quiet understanding in his gaze. "I think you are." And with that, Elara knew. She was ready to take her place, not just as the Toymaker's apprentice, but as a creator of new worlds. Worlds where broken things could be mended, where dreams could be brought back to life. With one last glance at the mended toys, Elara picked up her carving knife. The journey was just beginning.